Assalamu alaikum. I am Khaled Abou El Fadl. My good friend Nader Hashemi asked me to record a short message. I very fondly remember my visit to Malaysia, and I miss being there. I'm honored to be speaking to you. Nader Hashemi asked me to say something about, more broadly, my book, Reasoning with God, and more specifically, Chapter 8 in Reasoning with God, Chapter 8 titled, What Really Went Wrong. As many of you might immediately realize, that the title of that chapter, What Really Went Wrong, with the emphasis on really, is in part a response to the rather well-known book written by Bernard Lewis, and also article, What Went Wrong, in which he attempts to explain the Muslim condition through his own frames of reference. And the Chapter 8, What Really Went Wrong, traces what I believe is the cause of a modern, contemporary crisis in the intellectual heritage of Islam at the current moment. In this chapter, I outline the rise of two primary movements in response to colonialism and modernity. The first is the apologetic movement, which aimed to defend the Islamic tradition against a sustained system of critique by colonialism and the elite, which had become closely allied with the colonial heritage in putting many Muslims in a defensive position towards their intellectual heritage and their tradition. And rather than go through the various arguments in the book, and particularly in the chapter, What Really Went Wrong, I'll just make a few comments about what I believe are the most salient and necessary points. In the rise of apologetics, the purpose was to fend off a sustained cultural critique, against Muslim history and Muslim epistemology. This is the first movement that I discuss in the book. The second movement, which is the rise of Wahhabism, or more generally Puritanism, which is a system of thought that applied what I call in the book systems of law, or orders of law, where there is an attempt to impose a paradigm of textual order, or a laws derived in text in lieu of, and often counter to, culture, and to close the space available for individuality and autonomy to occupy the space with textuality and the perception of a divinely imposed order. The most important thing is that whether apologetics or the rise of Puritanism from the heartland of Najd, an area which has been outside of the narrative of Islamic history for most of the history of Islam until the modern age, when the movement from Najd arises and takes over Hijaz and then leverages its message throughout the Muslim world. What is of primary concern is that both apologetics and Puritanism developed a codependent relationship upon each other, a false sense of security and a false sense of absoluteness and even arrogance at the expense of natively expressed forms of Islamicity that has sprung throughout Islamic history. It is fair to say that, in my view, without the study of history, we forego the study of identity, that a people without history is a people without identity. And to the extent that Muslims are able to engage their historical legacy analytically and critically, to scrutinize it and learn from it, not from the perspective of apologetics, not from this perspective of constructing this history so that it falsely services issues of anxiety related to Muslim identity in the modern age, and not in the sense of idealizing this history either, so that it constructs a false paradigm of idealism that will quickly come into contention with the very reality of cultural complexity, of the richness of the richness of life itself. Both apologetics and Puritanism impose a false paradigm upon the essential humanity and humanness of Islamic history. So in this chapter, and what drove me to write that chapter, what really went wrong, is the deep concern and also an awareness that the primary challenge of our age is not the challenge of political power or military power. The primary challenge of our age is the jihad of the intellect, the ability for Muslims to meet the challenges of their historical moment intellectually, and to anchor themselves in their tradition while creatively negotiating that tradition to meet the challenges imposed by our modern moment. Both apologetics and Puritanism are a system of copping out of history. It's a system of checking out of history, of in many ways marginalizing historical narrative in order to feed an essential anxiety about identity, but without creatively confronting and bravely confronting the challenges that we as Muslims confront in our age. Put it in a because I promised that this would be a short introduction. The same tradition that has produced towering intellectual figures such as Ibn Rushd or Ibn Sina or Ibn Aqil, that same source of inspiration that gave rise to one of the most profound civilizations that humanity has ever uh, uh, um, experienced, cannot be reduced to either an apologetic discourse or to a puritanical discourse that thinks that culture can be eradicated in favor of textual imperatives. What is the intellectual impetus that gave rise to the Islamic civilization initially was a very honest impetus and a very inspired impetus. And I admit that in writing Reasoning with God is my attempt to rediscover and re-uncover that impetus once again, to search for what it means to fully embrace the Islamic history with all its positives and negatives, with all its victories and failures, while creatively and analytically negotiating compromises and mediated solutions for our age. I wish that I would have it would have been a real privilege for me to be able to hear the discussions on especially this chapter, what really went wrong. But I know that you have a great speaker and a great scholar, Nader Hashemi, leading the conversation about this chapter. It would have been a pleasure beyond pleasures for me to attend that. But I hope the discourse inspires the sense of passion that I have about Islamic history and the Islamic intellectual tradition. And anything that deprecates and dumbs down this tradition to a system of packaged responses and knee-jerk reactions is something that I see as remarkably unfortunate. The Islamic intellectual tradition and heritage is remarkably rich, and it is also remarkably nuanced and remarkably powerful. And it needs great intellects in order to negotiate it and renegotiate it for the particular challenges that confront us in the modern age. It needs brave intellects far more than it needs powerful weapons or powerful economies. And any great intellect starts from the point of honesty. If we are not able to be honest and free thinkers about our own tradition, then we abdicate that role to non-Muslim interpreters who will engage that tradition for us and confront us with a narrative about that tradition that, as has happened with the history of Orientalism, has been remarkably alienating. But between the cycle of confronting that narrative by the other about Islamic history, either through the knee-jerk reaction of apologetics or the aloof reaction of Puritanism, it's a vicious cycle that has the world we live in today is material proof of what that vicious cycle leads to. I hope that Reasoning with God can inspire some honest and frank conversations about the Islamic intellectual legacy, uh, which is a legacy that I have all the confidence in the world is nuanced enough, sophisticated enough, and powerful enough to withstand any level of honest discourse. Um, Thank you very much. I've again, I'm very honored to be with you, and assalamu alaikum.